So we're here today to talk about the Cascadia corridor. We have our panelists today who are truly dignitaries in their own right. They all are from public agencies and they have a distinguished service in the public sector, both at the national, the federal level, and also at the local and regional level. I'll let them introduce each of them as we go through in a minute here. But we're going to talk about the Cascadia corridor today, which is one of the most dynamic, if not most productive corridors in the nation or in North America, extending from Oregon all the way up to Vancouver, BC. This is an exciting corridor. It's in a corridor that has been thinking about high-speed rail for almost a decade, if not longer. And it's closer to coming to reality. And we'll hear a little bit more about it, and we'll hear about it both from the state of Washington's perspective, who right now is the lead agency, and then also hear about it from Oregon, the state of Oregon, and also from British Columbia. And we also have a guest today from Amtrak. Amtrak is the closest we have in the US for a national railroad system, but Amtrak has really stepped up in the last few years in terms of its interests around high-speed rail around the country. In fact, they just recently appointed and have a new member, Andy Byford, who used to run Toronto Transit Authority, or Metro, and he's the new Senior Vice President for high-speed rail. So they're taking it very seriously, so we're interested in hearing from Amtrak as well, who also is the operator of the Cascadia current existing intercity rail that goes from Oregon up to Vancouver. One reflection of all the great discussions we heard today is I was thinking around the term of ROI. I'm sure all of you are familiar with what ROI is, but I think of it differently. And what I heard today exemplified that, and I think this presentation will as well. It's not return on investment, but it's return on impact. So what we're doing and why we're here today talking to you about all these great projects and solutions and applications and also great programs is really what is the return on impact that these are providing. And I hope you'll hear that from our panelists today. So I'm first going to ask Amy Scarton to introduce herself and to tell us a little about herself.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Scarton. I'm the Deputy Secretary of Transportation for Washington State. I have been with the Washington State DOT for a decade now. Prior to my role as the deputy, where I essentially act as the chief operating officer of a DOT of more than 7,000 employees with an annual budget of $5 billion. Prior to that role, I ran Washington State Ferries for 4 years and had some wonderful interactions with BC Ferries, among others. And prior to that, I was in a role that Lynn created when she was Governor Inslee's first-term Secretary of Transportation, where we brought together all of the multimodal elements of the state DOT and focused on planning and modal integration. Prior to my decade in Washington State, I had 15 years in Washington, D.C., where I held a variety of roles, both in the legislature and 2 different appointments to U.S. DOT.
Great. Chase?
Hello, I am Chase Kitchen, Government Affairs Manager for the Greater Northwest for Amtrak, where in my role right now, I currently help state and local communities figure out how to best use intercity passenger rail to address their mobility needs. I've been with the Amtrak team for about 1.5 years, and prior to that, I've spent a little over a decade working with on environmental and transportation policy and roles in Seattle Mayor's office and Congress, really just trying to help folks figure out how to improve transportation mobility while reducing their environmental impact.
Hi, I'm Lynn Peterson, Metro Council President of the Portland Metro Region. We serve 1.7 million people within the Portland Metro Region, and we sit between the state and the counties and have a potpourri of things that we do, and some of you heard that earlier. Transportation land use planning is one of those, and my background is civil and environmental engineering, starting at Wisconsin DOT, and then moving my way through a journey of life, trying to figure out how best to provide transportation projects that actually build community, rather than just building a project. So I have served from stem to stern, both staff and elected, This is an elected role. The last role I had was working for Governor Inslee, running the Department of Transportation for the state of Washington.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Volk. I'm Assistant Deputy Minister with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure based in Victoria. Civil engineer by training as well. And I've been with the Ministry of Transportation for about 15 years now. Had some experience in local government and consulting before that. In my current role, I've got what I think is a fabulous portfolio with the ministry. I get to work with some really talented teams on integrated transportation and development planning, on transit-oriented development, as well as the delivery of major projects across the province. We've got SkyTrain expansion and new bridges, and exciting projects like high-speed rail that we get to work on together.
Great, well, thank you. And so a lot of the presentations today and other talks we heard today really were focused around how to make cities more livable, more mobile. But what we're talking about here is intercity, the connections between major metropolitan areas and the connections in between. And so, Amy, do you want to give us a little history on Cascadia High-Speed Rail and where it is today?
Sure. So as Peter mentioned, our agencies have been working on the vision for ultra-high-speed rail for nearly a decade now. And the idea to connect Vancouver, BC to Seattle, Portland, and beyond at speeds of up to 250 miles an hour or 400 kilometers an hour. Now this ultra-high speed, the purpose for us pursuing this notion, and we are still technology agnostic, but the notion of that level of speed is that we would connect the city pairs of travel times of up to or less than an hour. So imagine being here today, getting on an ultra high-speed ground transportation system and landing in Seattle in 1 hour. Maybe some of you took the train up last night or the day before. We're going to get into that. It did not take an hour, but it was a lovely ride. It was a lovely ride. And mobility, of course, is a driver for the project, but in addition, our North Star is really about connecting the Cascadia region. It's about closer economic connectivity, it's about trade, commerce, it's about land use, population growth, GHG reductions. All of these goals are wrapped into what we are pursuing amongst our agencies. We are still in the early planning stages, and we've been doing some planning for a while. Going back to 2017, we've started to work on this. In 2018, the governments of Washington State and BC signed our first MOU. We started in on concept planning, on a business case analysis, economic impact addendum. We continued on, we renewed our MOU and included Oregon. In 2022, we received some major funding from a number of partners. I'm sure some folks will talk about that, but just on the Washington side of things, our state legislature continued to fund, to the tune of $4 million, additional planning work. So we're in our 5th planning study now. But most importantly, they put up $150 million of state match for us to go after some really big federal dollars. And that's what we've been putting our effort in this past year. We've applied to the FRA for 3 different grant opportunities. One is focused more on our existing Cascades intercity system, which is integral to making the future high-speed system work. And the other 2 are to really move this ultra-high-speed concept from planning into project development. So we are extremely excited and fairly confident we'll be getting good news from the federal government here at the end of the year.
Great, and it's not unusual that we have multi-state programs. You may have heard about the Bright Line, which is California or Las Vegas to Los Angeles or Southern California. Obviously, the Northeast Corridor extends through multiple states and so forth. But this is going to be the first, I think, international kind of new high-speed rail development, and that in and of itself brings unique challenges. So, Kevin, do you want to talk to us a little bit about what British Columbia and your interest in high-speed and your partnership with WashDOT?
Sure, thanks. It's true. I mean, that this is one of the first examples of looking at crossing a border with a service like this. And, you know, from our perspective and BC's perspective, and certainly probably from Washington's perspective as well, when the pandemic hit and the border closed and the transportation services closed, you don't realize how integrated British Columbia and Washington and the entire Cascadia region are until it's severed. And there's the tourism and the business work that we do, but it's also families. It's Indigenous groups that are cut across by a border. There's families that move back and forth, and it really reinforced the need for ongoing partnership and to be able to look at new means to be able to move quickly between Canada and the United States. I live in Victoria, and as the crow flies, it's probably just as close to Seattle as it is to Vancouver, but Vancouver is an easy and relatively inexpensive trip. But Seattle is, it takes some planning to get there, and it shouldn't have to be that way. I think for British Columbia, we're very excited. We've always identified, and our Premier has always identified with Cascadia as a region and the similarities we have between Washington State and Oregon. And this is one really concrete way of being able to advance that.
That's great. Amy, you want to talk about Oregon and its role in the Cascadia corridor? Lynn.
No, that's okay.
Oh, sorry.
I'm like, she probably knows too. You know, I think there's a handful of folks right now in Oregon that are really, you know, interested and engaged, from the business side to the legislators to the electeds. But I'm going to be quite honest, we have one of the largest projects right now that the state has had to focus on, and that is the Columbia River Bridge replacement project on I-5. The Oregon DOT has not actually had a mega project since we built the I-205 project and the I-205 bridge. So that was 3+ decades ago, 4 decades ago. So this has been a big lift for a project that's going to be $6 to $7 billion in between 2 states, and it is the second time through. So honestly, that's where the time and attention was just spent. And I'm glad to report that the Oregon legislature actually came through with their $1 billion of commitment just this last week. So round of applause for the Oregon legislature. Now we can move on to other things. So that is really where we're at right now. And what's interesting about this moment in time is we're going to have to figure out how to have this conversation. Like I was talking about, the 50-year plan conversation. This is big because the end of the line, so to speak, even if there's intercity rail beyond that that's, you know, bucked up in terms of service, and even if it's made quicker, what do you do with that? Because Oregon starts with land use, not with transport. So what do we want to be? How do we want to use this investment? And what is that going to look like visually? And I think that's where we're headed. That's where I would like to take us first, is where could it land? And what are those possibilities for the future for creation of what we've seen in other countries around stations, for development opportunities, for housing, which we're all in a housing crisis, for advanced research and development, for training, workforce training. All of these things should play a role in that being a hub. And where does that, who benefits from that? That's going to be the question. Who gets this windfall, so to speak, of public investment? And does it actually move us forward on all of our climate change and racial equity goals, or does it move us back? So I think that's where we're at now, is how do we start this discussion of how to be the best partner we can and say, this is the vision we have for ourselves. How do we integrate that in?
Great. And Chase, you want to talk a little about Amtrak's perspective and role on a national network, but also specifically within the Cascadia corridor?
Yeah, thank you. We are, as you mentioned earlier, we are America's passenger rail operator, right? We are currently connecting all of these communities by passenger rail each day, multiple times a day. And for a long time, you know, the Cascades corridor has been kind of held up as an example for how communities, how regions can connect each other. You know, it's the only corridor outside of the Northeast corridor, or Seattle and Portland at least are the only 2 major cities where more people take the train than they fly between the 2 cities. Right now, the Cascades service is selling a higher percentage of seats on the train than anywhere else in the country, right? There is tremendous demand for connecting the communities by passenger rail, and that's with service that takes about 4 hours to get from Seattle to Portland, or Seattle to Vancouver, and a little over 3 to get between Seattle and Portland. And it struggles with on-time performance, right? Because we primarily operate over our freight rail partners. But despite those challenges, right, it's a really exciting service and where it's going. We currently operate 4 trains a day between Seattle and Portland. We will be going to 6 later this year. We've committed to the states to do that. But it's also, Congress just did all of this federal investment in passenger rail for the first time ever. We've got $66 billion, which is, for funding for the next 5 years, which is more than Amtrak has received in its previous 50 years combined. And we're putting that money to use in the national network. The first place a lot of that money is going is in the Cascade corridor. We're getting the first new trains off the assembly line. They're going to go into service in 2026. So we're making all of the investments now in the facilities to accommodate those new train sets. Our state partners are going through their service development plans to get ready for the new federal investments so that we can improve reliability, we can expand service, we can cut down the travel times on the existing corridor. So our role is getting folks there now. Our desire is to do even more, right? To do it faster, to do it more reliably, and really connect these communities across the region.
Right, great. And also, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the federal funding picture and environment, but for us that have been in the trenches for the last 20, 30, or a generation, we're in a period that's unprecedented in terms of the level of investment that we're seeing in passenger rail, both specifically for Amtrak, but also for programs like Cascadia. And I know leave it open to all of you to respond to that. To where do you see that as really being a game changer for us going forward, and at this point where we are with Cascadia?
Well, so just from Amtrak perspective, right? I was just the idea of getting more money in 5 years for passenger rail as a whole. It's now all coming to Amtrak, right? But passenger rail investment, we're going to get in the next 5 years more money than we've had in the previous 50 years. But we also want to keep in mind that that $66 billion pales in comparison to what we spend in highways on this continent and what in some of our peer countries where we want to achieve the level of service we want to achieve, right? That $66 billion is also just kind of a starting fund if we want to really get to those things. But you got to start somewhere. It's just getting started is exciting, right? We and at Amtrak, right, going from trying to make things work to trying to build something new and exciting and fun. It's a really I don't know. I've probably said exciting 14 times already, but it's great. It's a wonderful opportunity to really change how we get around in the region and connect.
I agree. And I'm so glad you brought up the Highway Trust Fund, so I didn't have to. But that's the reality of federal funding. We don't have a dedicated rail trust fund. We had our big blip during ARA. Now we have our second big blip. We will not get a national system. We will not get sustainable regional high-speed travel on trains unless we have sustainable federal funding. And so while we applaud all of the work that went into getting this funding out the door, both from the congressional level at USDOT, we need all of us to continue to pull for this in the future.
Great. All right, enough of the softball questions. So the Cascadia corridor was envisioned pre-COVID. We've all come through the COVID period. Different regions are responding differently. In the Bay Area, only 40% of the transit ridership has come back. I think Seattle is struggling a bit too with ridership coming back. I understand Vancouver or BC is doing well. It's almost at 80%. how do you respond to, I think there's a perception out in the industry, why are we making, high-speed rail is expensive. It'll be in the hundreds of billions, or 50 to 100 billion, who knows, in that order of magnitude. Why are we making this kind of an investment if we know that a large percentage of people are not coming back to work and not resuming the commute patterns that we had before? So I'll start with Lynn.
Well, our transit system is also seeing increases in ridership. Obviously not back to pre-pandemic, but we, just like every other major metropolitan city, are struggling to get our downtown reinvigorated and to have a new vision. I think the most important thing, though, on that is to remember that our downtowns in the United States have gone through a lot of transitions, and they've always come back. And so I'm very optimistic about how we come back. Will be important, but the opportunity is there to re-envision, so I'm excited about that. So as soon as our downtowns are back, I think a lot of our transit ridership will be back up to levels. So I think when you look at the demand for travel, right, and you look at the GHG emissions and the racial equity conversations that we are having about investment and these big goals that we have for ourselves, we need more options, and they need to be real options. And that's what high-speed rail is to me, is it's a real option to be able to go travel at an affordable rate that you may not get on an air, or because it's all about accessibility. So for the Portland area, it will be about the ability to access not just to the north, other markets and other recreation and other cities, but it will also make sure that within our state we are reconnecting. And for us, it's going to be about getting Corvallis and Eugene connected to Portland in a new way, because we are working on, along with others, trying to get a piece of the chips manufacturing money on the federal level to come and help spur more growth within the Portland region in terms of living wage jobs. So if we can make our two research universities that are nowhere near our population center closer by time, suddenly we have what other folks have at their ready, which we don't have, is that our research institutions need to be married more closely with our industry. So I think there's a whole different travel pattern that will come out of this in Oregon and the Cascadia corridor. Some of that is already there, because there's a lot of workers for companies that are headquartered in Seattle and Vancouver, BC, that want to live in Portland. So there's a latent demand, and I think we're going to be able to obviously leverage what we're seeing on the increase already on the Amtrak corridor and the Cascade corridor. So I think we've got a big latent demand that we should start to articulate what that is.
A couple things. One is, before COVID and after COVID, I mean, we have not seen any of the, you mentioned the employers, major employers in all three metropolitan areas and throughout the states and provinces have not wavered at all in terms of their message of, will you please hurry up with this? This is key to our long-term future. And, if any of you are currently enjoying your experiences in airports or traveling on our busy freeways, then maybe we don't need rail, but I think we do need to look at an alternative. Building on that, you don't look at the rail investment in a bubble. I know, King County and the Seattle metropolitan area are looking at having to expand their airport. At some point, Vancouver is going to have to look at expanding its airports as well. I mean, there's transportation investments that are going to be made, and we really need to figure out which mode works best for that and be able to direct the funding to those.
Amy, from Washington's perspective, and how are you feeling about the demand for something like high-speed rail post-COVID?
Well, I think for us, it's a longer-term outlook. And just looking at the population growth in our state, I would posit that we don't have a lot of other options. We're growing by 1 million people every decade. That has borne true over the last 2 decades, and that is forecasted out for the next 3. So over the 5 decades that we're working to plan, design, and implement this project, we will have grown by another 5 million people. And Could we physically widen I-5 to even accommodate that growth? Do we have the airports to accommodate that growth? We'll be looking at that. One of the first things we're going to do in this next calendar year with the project is we'll start to run a combined scenario analysis where we look at an I-5 option, some advanced air mobility, and high-speed rail to get this ground layer of planning to show what is and is not doable.
Well, great. We also have an author in our midst. Lynn just recently published this book, Roadways for People, which is about rethinking transportation planning and engineering. And it really focuses on issues around sustainability, around equity, particularly around developing mega programs, mega transportation projects. Lynn, you want to talk a little bit about how is high-speed rail, which I think is perceived generally as a premium type service focused for business travelers that can afford an expensive train trip because they need to get to their destinations quickly. How can high-speed rail be thought of from a perspective that you've written about in your book?
Thank you. The reason I wrote, again, the book is it's the combination of how do you actually have successful implementation of small to medium to very large projects. And it really comes down to whether you've engaged people or whether you're trying to roll people, right? So I think the most important thing for me out of this process is that we take the lessons learned from the interstate and we say, up front, we rolled a lot of communities, we hurt a lot of communities, and we cannot do that again. So that's one of the first things that I talked about as we started to get together and include Oregon is if you make the assumptions going to downtown Portland or anywhere near downtown Portland, the northeast Portland that would potentially come through is our most impacted communities from I-5, and they are still in trauma today. So that's like the first place I start is that we cannot put another interstate through any part of these already impacted and traumatized communities. So I think from the standpoint of how we create this process so that it is community-led at the local level for decision-making while still moving forward, because it's going to be very complicated with two states, another country, right? And how we each work through those solutions with our folks are completely different. Having spent time in Washington State, completely different process is expected by the residents than it is in Oregon. So we're gonna have to figure that out, but as long as we have an eye on the prize with the outcomes and we get agreement on the outcomes, then it's, okay, so now how do we knit all of that together? And what we're learning from the I-5 bridge project is that there are a lot of different ways in which we can repair community by making sure that we're hiring local, that we're hiring at a very high rate disadvantaged business enterprises, that we're not just hiring disadvantaged business enterprises, that we're actually using contractors that are owned by minority, that we have basically put barriers in front of them even though they've done major projects in the past. So hiring is part of that, but it's also the investment, for instance, in the Rose Quarter to the south where we're trying to put a cap and make that cap on the highway actually buildable, and how does that become almost a land trust for ownership by community so that the investment is intergenerational. So I think, as we start to think about this, the process is as important in the decision making and who's engaged and how they're engaged and what we're doing now to get them ready to be engaged so they can be at the table and we get that input directly from the community in ways that they feel safe making those comments and providing that information on their own lived experience. I think that's going to be probably the most impactful thing that we could do as Cascadia Corridor is show how to do it differently than we did the interstate.
And just to lead off of Lynn's point there, to show how we're taking those concepts and embedding that into our project, in addition to the multimodal scenario planning, our task for this next year is to come up with corridor-wide community engagement planning. And although it will be corridor-wide, it will not be monolith. It will look differently in each city up and down the corridor, in each state, province, county. And that will be centered on equity, community-led, where we currently are, and we plan to even more, work with tribal governments, indigenous First Nations governments. We are moving from a governance structure where we have the DOTs and the regional elected officials as the lead, and we are broadening that out. The next iteration of our governance structure is more of a ground up. It's talking to the mayors in all of the communities. It's talking to the tribal councils in all of the communities. And so that is really, job number one for this next year, to make this more than a brilliant idea from the state DOTs, right?
Great. Just time check, everyone. I'm going to ask one lightning round of questions to our panelists, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask questions. So get your questions ready. So the lightning round here is, the rest of the world has pretty much done high-speed rail. Japan is on their 5th generation of high-speed rail train sets. China developed 5,000 miles of high-speed rail in a decade. Morocco has high-speed rail, Turkey has high-speed rail, and we still, in this country, North America, we still do not have a true high-speed rail system. 6 miles of the Northeast Corridor does go above 125 miles per hour. Okay, I'll give that. We have 6 miles of it somewhere between Boston and New York. But when are we going to get high-speed rail in the Cascadia Corridor? This is a lightning round. Don't think about it too much. Don't put too many words around it. I just want your projections.
So assuming we have a good chunk of federal funding, I still think we are 15 years out.
Not soon enough.
Yes.
Very good answer. Okay.
I'm just going to say ditto. I hate crystal balling.
15 years would be fabulous.
All right. It takes a long time to do these projects. So, just to put a footnote on that, it took Japan 20 years before they did their first bullet train. It took France 25 to 30 years when they first thought of it till it actually got implemented. So it's not unusual that 15 years to do something of this magnitude. Okay, we have 5 minutes left before your cocktails. Are there any questions? If not,
15 was aggressive, and that was not inclusive of the 7 years of planning already under our belts.
that's right. We have one question here, please.
Yeah, sure. Gwendol Caslan from Destination Vancouver. So thinking of this from a tourism perspective, really interested in high-speed rail. But my question is around how do states and maybe the federal government think about their relationship to the carbon emissions with interstate travel? And like an example in France is putting a higher cost on the emissions associated with flights within the country, and is there anything to learn from that, and that would help advance high-speed rail?
And are you any panelists in particular, or is it open mic?
Open mic. Go ahead.
I'll just add that France just a month ago has eliminated all short-haul domestic air flights. So it's not so much a penalty for carbon emissions, but they've eliminated flights. So now your option is taking high-speed rail.
I think the short version answer to that question is we don't do it well enough, right? And I like to actually hold up an example from Vancouver, in raising some taxes to invest in the public transit here, right? They did a very good job of, doing a whole examination of the cost of an infrastructure project, right? And these two both talked very well about some of the negative impacts that the highway system did. on communities, but that pain still sticks with us today, even just looking in the state budgets, right, in the federal highway budgets, right? That Vancouver study did a great job of highlighting that for about every dollar a user of a car pays in order to get their destination, right? Society pays as a whole like $8, right? Whereas public transit, the return on impact is much better, and it's sometimes even net even, right? You get folks on bikes, it's a positive impact overall. So doing a better job of accounting for those things, I think, transforms the investments that we make, right? I talked about $66 billion in passenger rail was just invested from the federal government. Still paled in comparison to the amount of money they put in the Highway Trust Fund, and from that I think we have enough knowledge to know that those type of investments in cars and such are a little bit of a case of a good money chasing after bad, right? And continues to worsen those type of problems.
As a former travel demand forecaster, I guess I would say, having sat on a conversation around the expansion of the Portland airport, we're very constrained there. We're very constrained on expansion of I-5. But yet, everything within our federal system and a lot of our state processes still across the nation are the assumption that you build to some sort of linear growth, right? And that you don't look at these trade-offs and the capacity that you have within an entire corridor. It was one of the things that we did at WashDOT is we changed our congestion report in the I-5 corridor, essentially, and other major highway corridors to a capacity conversation. So while there might not be capacity on I-5, there was capacity in the parallel bus. There was capacity in the parallel light rail system, biking, pedestrian. We accounted for all of those to change the conversation. So I guess what I would say is we have to start backcasting. We have to know what we want to be when we grow up, and we need to articulate that vision better and say, yeah, we have a highway. Yeah, we have a light rail. We'd like to have a high-speed rail. Now, how does that play out, and what do we not have to do because of that? But, FAA, FRA, everybody is still on this assumption that you have to build to meet some sort of demand that actually is built on some really bad assumptions about how we do land use and transportation in the United States, right? We just make this assumption. And in reality, those trips want choice because they're people. And that's not part of our conversation a lot.
And in Washington State, we are now a cap and invest state. We have, for 2 decades, we've had state law emission reduction goals, but they were goals with not a lot of teeth. Now we have the teeth. We are taxing carbon. We have created 3 new climate change funds where those tax receipts go into. We are auctioning off credits. We are funding carbon-free transportation projects like never before for walking, biking, electric transit, and so on. And so we now have the scheme at a state level that will point us towards high-speed rail. And not to speak for Amtrak, but at last year's rail conference, Stephen gave this fantastic speech saying, we do not get to a carbon neutral or carbon free or even a reduced carbon portfolio in this country without more rail.
Well, there we go. Any other questions? If not, I think we've completed our panel. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it. Please, a round of applause for our panelists.